Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through time. If you're new here, welcome, and if you've been here before, it's wonderful to have you return. Tonight, we're going somewhere truly ancient, back to the very edge of recorded memory. To a time when the boundaries between earth and heaven seemed thin, and strange stories were told around fires that have long since turned to ash. Get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let your breathing slow. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just rest, and let me tell you about the Watchers, those mysterious beings who walked the ancient world before history as we know it truly began. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always beautiful to see how far these old stories can travel, connecting us across continents and centuries. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's step back together, far back, to a world that exists now only in fragments of clay and whispers of myth. The story begins not with a single voice, but with many. Long before the great empires rose, before the libraries and the temples we often think of when we imagine ancient history, there were already stories. These stories were old even when they were first pressed into wet clay tablets, old when they were sung beside rivers whose names we've forgotten. And among all these ancient tales, few have endured quite like the stories of the Watchers, those beings who descended from the heavens and changed everything. Imagine, if you will, the ancient world, not the ancient Rome sleep story we might picture, with its marble columns and paved roads, but something far older, far quieter. This is a world of mud brick villages scattered across river valleys, where the night sky blazes with stars, unobscured by any city lights, where the darkness is total and profound. In this world, people looked up at those stars and wondered. They wondered what lay beyond, who might be watching them from those distant points of light. The air would have been different then, cleaner, sharper, filled with the scent of wood smoke and river water. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the land was fertile and generous. Farmers worked fields of barley that swayed in warm breezes. Shepherds guided their flocks across grasslands that stretched to distant horizons. At night, when work was done, families gathered and stories were told. Always, stories were told. And among those stories, whispered in the darkness, were tales of beings who were not quite human, not quite divine, something in between. The Watchers, the ones who watched over humanity in those earliest days. The ones who, according to the ancient texts, saw the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and descended to walk among mortals, bringing with them knowledge that was never meant to be shared. This is not simply ancient mythology. This is bedtime history woven from threads of tradition that stretch back to the very beginnings of writing itself. Let yourself relax deeper into these ancient words, these ancient images. There is something soothing about stories this old, something that connects us to every human being who has ever looked up at the night sky and wondered. The origins of the Watcher tradition are difficult to trace with absolute certainty. As with all truly ancient things, the beginning becomes hazy, mythological, almost dreamlike. But we can start in Mesopotamia, in that fertile crescent where human civilization first began to organize itself into something recognizable. Here, in Sumer, and later Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, the people developed elaborate mythologies to explain their world. In these early Mesopotamian traditions, there were beings called the Apkallu, wise sages, part human and part divine, who came before the great flood that features in so many ancient Near Eastern stories. The Apkallu were sent by the god Enki to teach humanity the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, agriculture, the building of cities. They were intermediaries, bridges between the realm of gods and the realm of humans. Picture a scribe in ancient Uruk, one of the world's first true cities. It is late afternoon, and golden light slants through the doorway of his small chamber. He sits cross-legged on a reed mat, a clay tablet before him, a stylus in his practiced hand. He has been copying an old text, one handed down from his teacher, who learned it from his teacher, who learned it from someone long ago whose name has been forgotten. The text speaks of the Apkallu, of those ancient wise ones who brought knowledge to humanity when the world was young. The scribe works slowly, carefully, pressing the wedge-shaped tip of his stylus into the soft clay, forming the cuneiform characters that will harden and last for thousands of years. He does not know that we will one day read his words. He does not know that his careful copying is preserving something that will echo through millennia. He knows only that the story is important, that it must be preserved, that the Apkallu must be remembered. In the Mesopotamian imagination, these beings were generally beneficent. They helped humanity. They were teachers, guardians. But there was always something ambiguous about them, something liminal. They belonged to two worlds and fully to neither. And this ambiguity, this in-betweenness, would become central to the later tradition of the Watchers. As centuries passed, these stories traveled, trade routes connected distant cities, merchants carried not just goods but also ideas, myths, narratives. The Mesopotamian traditions about divine human intermediaries encountered other cultural traditions, other ways of thinking about the relationship between heaven and earth. And somewhere in this great mixing of ideas, the specific tradition of the Watchers began to crystallize. The most detailed ancient account of the Watchers comes from a text called the Book of Watchers, which forms the first section of a larger work known as the First Book of Enoch. This text, written sometime around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, preserves traditions that are certainly much older, reaching back perhaps to the 4th or 5th century BCE, or even earlier. It is an example of what scholars call Second Temple Jewish literature, texts written during the period when the Second Temple stood in Jerusalem, a time of great creativity and theological reflection. Let yourself breathe slowly as we enter this world. Imagine Jerusalem in those centuries before the Common Era. The city sits on its hills, limestone buildings glowing golden in the late afternoon sun, narrow streets wind between houses. The temple dominates the skyline, its courts bustling with pilgrims and priests. But our attention is not on the grand public spaces. Instead, picture a quiet room somewhere in the city, or perhaps in a village in the surrounding countryside. A scholar sits with a scroll. The light is fading, and he will need to light an oil lamp soon. He is writing, adding to a text that has been growing over time, a text that tries to make sense of old traditions, old stories that have been passed down but never fully explained. He is writing about the Watchers, those angels who descended to earth in the days before the flood, and what happened because of their transgression. The story, as the Book of Watchers tells it, begins with a group of angels. Their number is given as 200, though this might be symbolic, who are stationed in heaven to watch over humanity. They are called the Watchers, the ones who do not sleep, who observe and report back to the divine throne. But as they watch, something happens. They begin to desire the human women they see below. They see that the daughters of men are beautiful, and they make a pact among themselves. Their leader, whose name is given as Shemiaza or Semiaza, organizes the rebellion. Picture these beings, these angels, gathering on Mount Hermon, a real mountain on the border of what is now Lebanon and Syria, snow-capped and majestic. They descend from heaven to this mountain, and there they swear an oath together. They will descend to earth. They will take human wives, and they will face the consequences together, bound by their collective vow. It is a solemn moment in the mythology. This oath on Mount Hermon, the mountain itself becomes significant. Its very name later interpreted as related to the Hebrew word for oath or curse. The landscape becomes part of the story. The cold peaks, the thin air, the sense of standing between earth and sky. All of this becomes the backdrop for this pivotal moment when heaven and earth are about to become entangled in ways that cannot be undone. And so they descend. 200 watchers come down from their celestial stations and take human women as wives. The text gives names to many of these watchers, names that have the ring of great antiquity: Shemihaza, Azazel, Armoros, Barachiel, Kakabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, and others. Each name carries meaning in Hebrew or Aramaic, often related to heavenly or natural phenomena. Kakabiel, for instance, means something like star of God. These are beings associated with cosmic forces, with the fundamental structures of creation. The marriages between watchers and human women produce children, and these children are not ordinary. They are the Nephilim giants, who grow to great size and strength. The text describes them as consuming all the resources of humanity, eating everything that humans produce, and then turning to eat the humans themselves, and even each other. They are described as 3,000 ells tall, a clearly mythological measurement meant to convey not realistic height, but rather the sense that these beings are wrong, too large, too powerful, and disruption of the natural order. But the transgression of the watchers is not only about forbidden marriages and monstrous offspring. It is also about knowledge. This is crucial to understanding the deeper meaning of the Watcher tradition. The Watchers, according to the Book of Watchers, teach humanity secrets that were meant to remain hidden. Different Watchers teach different forbidden arts. Azazel, one of the most prominent of the Watchers, teaches men to make weapons of war, swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He teaches the art of making bracelets and ornaments, and the use of cosmetics to beautify the eyes. This might seem an odd combination to modern ears, weapons, and cosmetics, but the ancient text sees both as forms of dangerous artificial enhancement, ways of changing what is natural. Other Watchers teach other things. One teaches astrology and the observation of the stars. Another teaches the interpretation of signs and omens. Another teaches the cutting of roots and plants, presumably for magic or medicine, arts that blur into each other in the ancient world. Another teaches enchantments and sorcery. The knowledge itself becomes a kind of pollution, a contamination of humanity's innocence. This theme of forbidden knowledge is ancient and powerful. It appears in many cultures, many traditions. Think of the Greek story of Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity, and is punished eternally for his transgression. The fear is not of knowledge itself, but of knowledge gained too soon. Knowledge that comes from breaking boundaries that are meant to be maintained. There is a sense that humanity needs to remain in a certain place of unknowing, at least for a time, and that premature knowledge brings only suffering. As you listen to this bedtime history, let your body relax more completely. Feel the weight of your head on your pillow. Feel your shoulders dropping, tension releasing. These are old stories, old fears, old attempts to understand why the world contains both wonder and suffering. They are part of the human effort to make meaning, and there is something deeply comforting about that, about knowing that humans have always tried to understand. The teaching of forbidden knowledge and the birth of the giants brings chaos to the earth. The Book of Watchers describes a world descending into violence and corruption. The earth is filled with blood and lawlessness. The natural order has been disrupted. The cry of humanity rises up to heaven, a plea for intervention. And intervention comes. The archangels, the good angels who have remained obedient, hear the cry of the earth. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel observe the chaos below and bring the matter before God. God responds by sending these loyal angels to earth to set things right. Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into darkness, into a place of sharp rocks in the wilderness. This image of the fallen angel, bound and buried in a desert place, is stark and powerful. The wilderness, in ancient Near Eastern thought, is the realm of chaos, of demons, of everything that stands opposed to civilization and order. To be cast into the wilderness is to be exiled from the cosmos itself. Gabriel is sent to stir up the Nephilim, to destroy each other, to turn the giants against one another, so that they kill each other in combat. The violence that came into the world through the Watchers will be turned back on itself, consuming itself. Michael is sent to bind Shemiheza and his associates, to imprison them in darkness until the final judgment. The text describes them as being bound in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations, a number that might be literal or might simply mean a very long time. Until the end of days, these fallen watchers will remain imprisoned, awaiting final punishment. The flood itself is announced, the great deluge that will cleanse the earth of the corruption introduced by the Watchers and their offspring. This connects the Watcher tradition to the flood narrative found in Genesis and in earlier Mesopotamian texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The flood becomes the reset, the moment when God wipes the slate clean and allows creation to begin again without the contamination of the forbidden knowledge and the unnatural beings. But even after the flood, according to the tradition, the problem is not entirely solved. The Nephilim die in the flood, but their spirits, disembodied, become demons that wander the earth, seeking to harm humanity. This explains, for the ancient audience, the origin of evil spirits, the malevolent forces that cause disease and misfortune and temptation. They are the lingering after-effects of that ancient catastrophe, the ongoing consequences of the Watchers' rebellion. Picture, if you will, a Jewish community in the Second Temple period, hearing this text read aloud. Perhaps it is evening, and the community has gathered in someone's home. An oil lamp flickers, shadows move on the walls. Outside, the stars shine in the same patterns they have always shone. The reader's voice is calm and measured, telling of events that happened long ago. In the days before the flood, in the time of the Watchers, the listeners would have heard in this story an explanation for the presence of evil in the world. They would have heard a warning about the dangers of transgressing boundaries, about the importance of maintaining the proper order of things. They would have heard, perhaps, a subtle commentary on their own time, on the ways that foreign influences and foreign knowledge might be seen as corrupting the purity of their tradition. But they would also have heard something comforting. The story tells them that evil is not eternal, not original. Evil came into the world at a specific moment, through a specific transgression. And God responded, binding the evildoers, promising a final judgment. The world might be filled with suffering and chaos now, but this is not how things are meant to be, and not how they will always be. The story offers both explanation and hope. This ancient civilization's awesome quality, this soothing rhythm of old narratives, has a way of calming the mind. There is something about hearing stories that are thousands of years old, stories that have comforted countless generations before us, that helps us let go of our own anxieties, our own troubles. Let yourself sink deeper into rest as we continue. The Book of Watchers also includes a section often called the Book of the Luminaries, or the Astronomical Book. This section focuses on Enoch's heavenly journey and his visions of the cosmos. Enoch, the patriarch, who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without dying, becomes the narrator and protagonist of the Watcher tradition. He is the righteous one, the human who is granted access to heavenly secrets, not through rebellion and transgression like the Watchers, but through divine favor. Enoch is brought to heaven by angels and shown the workings of the cosmos. He sees the movements of the sun and moon, the paths of the stars, the mechanisms by which the seasons change and time itself unfolds. This is legitimate knowledge, revealed appropriately by God through proper channels. It stands in contrast to the forbidden knowledge taught by the Watchers. The message is clear. Knowledge in itself is not the problem. The problem is how knowledge is obtained and for what purposes it is used. Imagine Enoch in these texts, a human lifted up beyond the earth, shown the fundamental structures of reality. He sees storehouses of snow and hail. He sees the gates through which the winds emerge. He sees the foundations of the earth and the ends of the heavens. Everything is ordered. Everything has its place and purpose. The cosmos is not chaotic, but beautifully arranged, and this order is a reflection of divine wisdom. Enoch also sees the places of punishment prepared for the fallen Watchers. He visits them in their imprisonment and hears their pleas. They ask him to intercede for them, to petition God on their behalf. Enoch, in a beautiful and haunting passage, brings their petition to God, but God refuses. The Watchers' sin is too great. They were beings of heaven who knew better, who violated not just commands, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. They will remain bound until the day of final judgment. There is something almost tragic in this. The Watchers, in some versions of the tradition, are portrayed not as purely malevolent, but as beings who made a terrible mistake, driven by desire, perhaps even by a kind of love, however misguided. They saw beauty and wanted to be part of it. They wanted to cross the boundary between heaven and earth, to experience what it meant to be human. And their punishment is eternal separation, imprisonment in darkness. Of course, the text does not ultimately side with the Watchers. Their transgression brought terrible suffering. The giants they fathered, consumed, and destroyed. The knowledge they taught was used for violence and corruption. But there is still something poignant about these beings who reached for something beyond their station and brought ruin on themselves and others. As the night deepens and you lie in your bed, in your own time, in your own place, think about how these stories have traveled. The Book of Watchers was written in Aramaic, probably in Judea or nearby regions. Sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, fragments of it have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, those precious manuscripts discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in the mid-20th century. These fragments, written on leather or papyrus, preserved in the dry desert climate for over 2,000 years, show us that the Watcher tradition was being read and copied and valued by at least some Jewish communities in the last centuries before the Common Era. The complete text of the Book of Enoch, including the Book of Watchers, was lost in most of the ancient world. It survived in its entirety only in Ethiopia, where it was preserved as part of the Ethiopian Orthodox biblical canon. For centuries, Western scholars knew of the Book of Enoch only through references and quotations in other ancient texts. Then, in the 18th century, European explorers in Ethiopia discovered that the text still existed, still being read in churches, still part of living tradition. Imagine that moment of rediscovery. Scholars in Europe reading ancient Ge'ez manuscripts brought back from Ethiopia and realizing that here was a text that had been lost for more than a millennium, now found again. The ancient words, preserved far from their place of origin, returned to be studied and translated and argued over. This journey of the text itself, from Judea to the Dead Sea caves, to Ethiopia, to Europe, and eventually to the whole world, is its own kind of story. A reminder of how ideas travel, how they survive against odds, how human beings have always sought to preserve what they find meaningful. The Watcher tradition did not remain isolated in the Book of Enoch. It influenced other Jewish texts from the Second Temple period. The Book of Jubilees, another text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, retells the early stories of Genesis with significant additions, including material about the Watchers. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Testament of Solomon, and other works from this period show awareness of the Watcher tradition and develop it in various ways. These texts come from a period of great creativity in Jewish thought, a time when many different groups had many different ideas about how to interpret the ancient scriptures and traditions. There were Pharisees and Sadducees, Essenes and Zealots, and many others whose names and teachings have not survived. Some of these groups were more open to apocalyptic and mystical ideas, and it is among these groups that texts like the Book of Enoch circulated. Imagine a young person in 1st century Judea, perhaps living in one of the communities that would later be associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. This young person has grown up hearing the traditional scriptures read in synagogue, but has also heard other texts, like the Book of Enoch, read by members of their community. For them, the Watcher tradition is not strange or marginal. It is part of their understanding of how the world works, how evil entered creation, what angels and demons are. When this young person reads in Genesis about the Nephilim, the giants who were on the earth in those days, they already know the full story. They know about the Watchers, about the oath on Mount Hermon, about the forbidden knowledge, about the punishment and the flood. The brief reference in Genesis is like the tip of an iceberg, and they know what lies beneath. This is how religious traditions work. They are never just the official texts, the canonical scriptures. They are also the accumulated layers of interpretation, story, elaboration. They are the conversations that happen around the central texts, the ways that communities make sense of passages that are ambiguous or puzzling. The Watcher tradition is one such elaboration, one way of understanding those strange verses in Genesis 6 about the sons of God and the daughters of men. Breathe slowly and deeply. Feel yourself relaxing into sleep, meditation, history. These old questions, these old stories, they asked about the same things we still wonder about. Where does evil come from? Why do bad things happen? Is there a plan, a purpose, or is everything chaos? The ancient world had its answers, and those answers were often told as stories, mythologies, that tried to make the incomprehensible more comprehensible. The Watcher tradition also appears in the New Testament, though more subtly. The letters attributed to Peter and Jude both reference the fallen angels and seem to know the broader Watcher tradition. In to Peter, there is a reference to angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus, or, in some translations, pits of darkness to be kept for judgment. In Jude, there is a reference to angels who did not keep their own position but left their proper dwelling, and who are kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. Jude even quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, citing a prophecy attributed to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. This quotation shows that at least some early Christians knew the Book of Enoch and regarded it as authoritative, or at least valuable. The Watcher tradition was part of the conceptual world of early Christianity, even if it eventually became less central in later Christian theology. Early Christian writers engaged with the Watcher tradition in various ways. Some, like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, knew the story of the Watchers and incorporated it into their understanding of the origin of demons and evil. They saw the fallen angels as explaining the presence of malevolent spiritual forces in the world, forces that opposed God and tempted human beings into sin. Picture an early Christian community, perhaps in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, gathering for worship in someone's home. They live in a world still dominated by the Roman Empire, a world where Christianity is not yet the official religion, but is growing, spreading, attracting converts from many backgrounds. These Christians are trying to understand their faith, to reconcile the Jewish scriptures they have inherited with the new teachings about Jesus. When they discuss angels and demons, when they talk about spiritual warfare and the powers of darkness, some of them draw on the Watcher tradition. It gives them a framework for understanding the cosmic conflict they believe they are part of. The Watchers are the original rebels, the first to fall, and their continuing influence in the form of demons explains why the world is still filled with evil and suffering even after the coming of Christ. But as Christianity developed and became more institutionalized, the Watcher tradition gradually faded from prominence in Christian theology. By the medieval period, most Western Christians no longer knew the Book of Enoch or the detailed Watcher narratives. The story was simplified and merged with the story of Lucifer and the fallen angels who rebelled out of pride, a different tradition with different origins. In the medieval Christian imagination, Satan and his demons fell because of pride and envy, not because of desire for human women or the teaching of forbidden knowledge. The emphasis shifted from the specific mythological narrative of the Watchers to a more abstract theological understanding of sin and rebellion. The Book of Enoch was lost to Western Christianity, surviving only in references and fragments. Yet the influence of the Watcher tradition never entirely disappeared. It persisted in various esoteric and mystical streams of thought. In Jewish mysticism, particularly in Kabbalistic texts, angels and their hierarchies remained important, and some awareness of the Watcher tradition continued. In Islamic tradition, which arose in the 7th century CE, and drew on both Jewish and Christian ideas, there are stories of fallen angels and jinn that show some similarities to the Watcher tradition, though developed in their own distinct ways. In the Islamic telling, there is a story of 2 angels, Harut and Marut, who are sent to earth and who teach magic to humanity. This story, mentioned in the Quran and elaborated in later post-Islamic texts, shares some thematic similarities with the Watcher tradition, angels descending to earth. The teaching of forbidden knowledge, the blurring of boundaries between the celestial and terrestrial realms. The specific details differ, but the underlying themes resonate. Imagine a scholar in medieval Baghdad, in the golden age of Islamic civilization, reading ancient texts in Arabic translation. Some of these texts preserve ideas from earlier Jewish and Christian traditions, ideas that have been transmitted and transformed. The scholar is interested in cosmology, in the nature of angels and demons, in the relationship between the seen and unseen worlds. In the library where he works, there are manuscripts from many traditions, many languages. Knowledge flows along trade routes, carried by merchants and travelers and pilgrims. He reads about the fallen angels, about beings who transgressed their nature and brought corruption to earth. He thinks about the jinn, those beings of smokeless fire mentioned in the Quran, who also occupy a liminal space between the physical and spiritual realms. He sees patterns, connections, the ways that different traditions ask similar questions and arrive at related, if not identical, answers. This is the nature of religious and mythological ideas. They do not stay pure and isolated. They travel, they mix, they influence each other. The Watcher tradition is part of a broader tapestry of thought about angels and demons, heaven and earth, knowledge and transgression. It appears in different forms, in different cultures, but the core themes remain recognizable. Let yourself relax even more deeply. Your breathing is slow and natural. Your body is heavy and comfortable. These stories from the ancient world, they are part of the great human conversation about meaning and morality, about what it means to live in a world that contains both beauty and horror, both wisdom and suffering. In the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah, which flowered in medieval Spain and later ensifed in the Galilee, there is extensive speculation about the nature of angels and the celestial hierarchies. The Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah, discusses angels and their roles. And while it does not always directly reference the Watcher tradition as found in the Book of Enoch, the underlying concepts of beings that bridge heaven and earth, of the possibility of cosmic disruption through transgression, remain present. Kabbalists spoke of multiple worlds or realms of existence, arranged hierarchically from the most spiritual and divine down to the physical world we inhabit. Angels exist in the higher worlds and can, under certain circumstances, influence the lower worlds. The idea of boundaries between these worlds and the danger of crossing those boundaries inappropriately is central to Kabbalistic thought. Picture a Kabbalist in 16th century Safed, that hillside town in northern Galilee that became a center of Jewish mystical study. He sits in a small stone house, a manuscript open before him. Outside, the evening is falling, and the hills are turning purple in the fading light. He is studying the emanations of the divine, the Sephiro, trying to understand how the infinite Ein Sof, the unknowable divine essence, manifests in the finite worlds below. He thinks about angels as expressions of divine will, as functionaries in the cosmic bureaucracy that maintains creation. But he also knows the old stories about angels who fell, about beings who disrupted the cosmic order. He sees in these stories warnings about the fragility of the created order, about how easily things can go wrong when boundaries are not respected. His studies are not merely intellectual. They are spiritual practices, ways of drawing closer to the divine. ways of participating in the ongoing work of repairing and maintaining creation. The stories of the Watchers remind him to be careful, to approach the mysteries with reverence and humility, to not seek knowledge or power inappropriately. In the Renaissance, European scholars began to rediscover ancient texts and to explore esoteric and occult traditions. Interest in angels and demons flourished, often in ways that combined Christian theology with elements from Kabbalah, Neoplatonism, and other sources. The Watcher tradition was not yet fully known. The complete Book of Enoch was still lost to European scholars, but ideas about fallen angels and forbidden knowledge circulated widely. Think of a Renaissance magus, perhaps someone like John Dee in Elizabethan England, fascinated by angels and eager to communicate with them. Dee believed that angels could reveal hidden knowledge, that they could teach him the secrets of nature and the cosmos. He and his associate Edward Kelly conducted elaborate rituals to summon and converse with angels, recording what they believed were genuine communications from celestial beings. In Dee's work, there is something of the old ambiguity about angelic knowledge. Is it legitimate for a human to seek such knowledge? What are the boundaries that should not be crossed? Dee himself believed he was acting appropriately, that he was seeking divine wisdom through proper channels. But others in his time suspected that he was trafficking with demons, that he had crossed a line into dangerous territory. The questions raised by the Watcher tradition about knowledge, boundaries, transgression, remained relevant even in the early modern period, even as the specific mythological narrative of the Watchers was largely unknown. It was not until the 18th century that the Book of Enoch was rediscovered in Ethiopia and brought to European attention. The Scottish explorer James Bruce traveled to Ethiopia in the 1770s and returned with manuscripts, including copies of the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez. Scholars began to translate and study the text, and gradually the full Watcher tradition became known again in the West. Imagine the excitement of scholars encountering this text for the first time in more than a millennium. Here was a detailed narrative that explained cryptic passages in Genesis and in the New Testament. Here was a whole cosmology, a whole mythology that had been lost and now was found. The text was strange and fascinating, sometimes beautiful, sometimes disturbing, always provocative. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as biblical scholarship developed and the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Book of Enoch came to be recognized as an important witness to Second Temple Jewish thought. Scholars studied it intensively, trying to understand its origins, its influences, its place in the development of Jewish and Christian ideas. The discovery of fragments of the Book of Enoch among the Dead Sea Scrolls was particularly significant. Here was proof that the text was known and valued in Judea in the last centuries BCE and the 1st century CE. It was not a later invention or a marginal oddity, but part of the living religious literature of at least some Jewish communities in the crucial period, when both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity were taking shape. You can rest in the knowledge that these texts, these stories, they survived against enormous odds. They survived the destruction of the Second Temple, the scattering of communities, the loss of manuscripts, the changes in religious fashion and theological emphasis. They survived because somewhere, in some community, someone valued them enough to copy them carefully, to preserve them, to pass them on to the next generation. In modern times, the Watcher tradition has found new audiences beyond scholars of ancient religion. The story of the Watchers has been retold in fiction, in films, in graphic novels. It has been taken up by various esoteric and New Age movements. Some see in the Watchers ancient astronauts, extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth in prehistory and were later mythologized as angels. This interpretation, popularized in the mid-20th century, reads the ancient texts through the lens of modern science fiction, seeing in the descent from heaven the arrival of beings from other worlds. Others see in the Watchers a metaphor for the dangers of technology and scientific progress. The teaching of forbidden knowledge becomes, in this reading, a warning about the ways that human knowledge can outpace human wisdom, leading to destructive consequences. The nuclear bomb, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, these are modern versions of the forbidden knowledge that the Watchers taught, powerful tools that could be used for good or ill, and which carry immense dangers. These modern interpretations show the continuing power of the Watcher tradition to speak to human concerns. The specific mythological framework may be ancient, but the questions it raises are perennial. What are the limits of human knowledge? What happens when we transgress boundaries? Who is responsible when power is misused? These questions are as relevant now as they were 3,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia or 2,000 years ago in Second Temple Judea. As you lie in the darkness of your room, in this present moment, you are connected to all those who have pondered these questions before you. The ancient scribe in Uruk, the Jewish scholar reading the Book of Enoch in the Second Temple period, the Kabbalist in Saft, the Renaissance magus, the modern academic, all asking, in their own ways and with their own concerns about the nature of knowledge and power, about the relationship between the human and the divine. Let's turn now to think about what daily life might have been like for the people who first told and heard these stories. Because the Watcher tradition did not exist in the abstract, it was part of lived religion, part of how real people in real places understood their world. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, life revolved around the cycles of agriculture and the rhythms of the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded annually, bringing rich silt that fertilized the fields. Farmers planted barley and wheat, dates and onions. Shepherds tended flocks of sheep and goats. Fishermen worked the rivers and marshes. Cities rose, built of mud brick, clustered around temples dedicated to the gods. The temple was the center of economic and religious life. It owned land, employed workers, stored grain. The priests and priestesses who served in the temples were educated, literate, part of a scribal class that preserved and transmitted knowledge. Picture a temple in ancient Babylon, in the time when the city was at its height. The temple rises above the surrounding buildings, its walls decorated with glazed bricks in brilliant blues and yellows. Inside, the air is cool and slightly dim. The scent of incense hangs in the air. Priests move through the courtyards, performing rituals that have been performed the same way for centuries. In one of the side rooms, a young scribe is being taught to read and write. He sits with his teacher, a tablet before him, practicing the cuneiform signs. He is learning the standard texts, the lists of words and phrases that every scribe must know. But he is also learning the old stories, the myths and legends that explain how the world came to be and how the gods interact with humanity. His teacher tells him about the Apkallu, those ancient sages who came before the flood and taught the arts of civilization. The boy listens, his eyes wide. He imagines these beings, part fish and part human in some depictions, emerging from the waters of the Apsu, the freshwater abyss below the earth, bringing knowledge and order. The story is not just entertainment, it is part of how the boy will understand his own role. He is learning to be a scribe, to be one who preserves and transmits knowledge. He is part of a chain that stretches back to the Apkallu themselves, part of the ongoing work of maintaining civilization against the forces of chaos. Centuries later, in the Persian period, in the 5th or 4th century BCE, a Jewish scribe in Judea or Babylon might have been doing similar work. The Jewish people had been exiled to Babylon in the 6th century BCE when the Babylonian Empire destroyed Jerusalem and the First Temple. Many had returned to Judea when the Persian Empire conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to go home. But a significant Jewish community remained in Mesopotamia. Picture this Jewish scribe working in a community in Babylon or perhaps back in Judea. He is part of a tradition that stretches back to Moses, to the giving of the Torah at Sinai. But he is also living in a world shaped by centuries of Mesopotamian culture. He knows the old Mesopotamian stories. He has heard about the Apkallu, and he is trying to make sense of the brief, cryptic references in his own scriptures to beings that seem similar. When he reads in Genesis about the Nephilim, about the sons of God and the daughters of men, he wonders. He has heard oral traditions, stories passed down from earlier generations that explain these verses. These stories speak of angels called watchers who descended from heaven, who took human wives, who taught forbidden knowledge. He begins to write these traditions down or to copy texts that others have written. He is contributing to what will become the Book of Enoch. He works in a small room, sitting on a mat on the floor, or perhaps on a low bench. Sunlight comes through a small window. Outside, he can hear the sounds of the street, people talking, animals passing, the everyday life of the community. But here, in this quiet space, he is connecting his present to the deep past, trying to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. For him, the story of the Watchers is not just mythology, it is theology. It explains why the world is the way it is. It explains the presence of evil, the existence of demons, the suffering that afflicts humanity. It also offers hope. The Watchers are bound, awaiting final judgment. God has not abandoned creation. The apparent victory of chaos and evil is temporary. In the end, justice will be done. This is the power of the Watcher tradition. It offers a narrative that makes sense of the world, that gives meaning to suffering, that provides both explanation and hope. For the people who believed it, it was not fiction but truth, the reality behind the appearances. In the centuries around the turn of the Common Era, Judea was under Roman control. This was the time of the Second Temple, rebuilt after the exile and expanded by Herod into a magnificent complex. It was a time of political tension, religious ferment, and apocalyptic expectation. Many people believed that the current age was drawing to a close, that God would soon intervene to establish his kingdom, to judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous. In this context, texts like the Book of Enoch had particular resonance. They spoke of divine judgment, of the punishment of the wicked angels and the evil powers that ruled the world. They promised that the righteous would be vindicated, that the suffering of the present age would give way to a new creation where justice prevailed. Imagine a small community living near the Dead Sea, perhaps the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have withdrawn from the main centers of Jewish life because they believe that the temple has been corrupted, that the priests are not following the proper laws. They live simply, pooling their resources, studying scripture intensively, preparing for the coming end times. For them, the Book of Enoch is an important text. They copy it carefully. They read it in their gatherings. They meditate on its visions. The story of the Watchers confirms their worldview. The current world is ruled by evil powers, but these powers have already been judged and will soon be destroyed. The community sees itself as the faithful remnant, as those who have remained true, while others have fallen into corruption. They live in a harsh landscape, the desert cliffs and caves near the Dead Sea. Water is scarce. The sun beats down mercilessly in summer. But they endure, sustained by their conviction that they are living in the final days, that their faithfulness will be rewarded. In the evenings, when the desert air cools and the stars come out in their multitudes, they gather to hear the scriptures read. The voice of the reader carries in the still air. He reads from the Book of Enoch, describing Enoch's journey through the heavens, his visions of the coming judgment. The listeners sit quietly, absorbing the words, finding in them strength to continue. This was the lived reality of the Watcher tradition for these communities. It was not an abstract theological concept, but a vital part of their understanding of who they were and what was happening in the world around them. As Christianity emerged and spread in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, some early Christian communities also valued the Book of Enoch. As mentioned earlier, the letter of Jude quotes from it, and other early Christian writers reference it. For these Christians, the Watcher tradition helped explain the cosmic dimensions of what they believed Christ had accomplished. Picture a Christian community in the 2nd century, perhaps in Syria or Asia Minor. They gather in someone's home for worship. They sing hymns. They share a meal. They listen to scriptures being read. Among the texts they hear are letters from apostles, gospels about Jesus, and also texts like the Book of Enoch. For them, Christ's death and resurrection are understood as a cosmic victory over the powers of darkness. These powers include the Watchers and the demons that arose from their offspring. Christ has defeated these evil forces, has bound them, has begun the process of restoring creation to what it was meant to be. The Watcher tradition provides the backstory, the explanation of how evil entered the world and how it will ultimately be defeated. A young woman in this community listens to these teachings. She lives in a world where evil seems powerful, where Christians are occasionally persecuted, where suffering is common. But the story gives her hope. The Watchers, for all their power, have been defeated. They are bound, awaiting final judgment. And if the Watchers can be defeated, then all evil can be defeated. She finds courage in this belief, strength to face whatever comes. The tradition continues to shape how Christians understand spiritual warfare. The idea that believers are engaged in a struggle not just with human opponents, but with spiritual forces. When Paul writes in Ephesians about struggling against principalities and powers, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, he is drawing on a worldview that includes fallen angels and cosmic conflict. The Watcher tradition is part of the deep background of this worldview. Breathe slowly. Let your body sink deeper into relaxation. These stories, these beliefs, they shaped how people lived, how they understood their suffering, how they found courage to continue. They are part of the human effort to make meaning, to find patterns, to assert that the universe is not merely chaos, but has purpose and direction. By the medieval period, as already mentioned, the Book of Enoch was lost to most of the Christian world, but the broader idea of fallen angels remained central to Christian theology. The story was simplified and merged with other traditions, particularly the story of Lucifer from Isaiah 14 and the dragon cast out of heaven in Revelation 12. In medieval Christian thought, the fall of the angels was understood as having happened because of pride. Satan, the highest of the angels, refused to bow before humanity when God created humans and commanded the angels to serve them. Out of pride and envy, Satan rebelled and was cast out of heaven, taking a third of the angels with him. This is a different story from the Watcher tradition. The emphasis is on pride rather than desire, on the fall happening before the creation of humanity rather than in the time of the patriarchs, on Satan as a single great adversary rather than a group of watchers teaching forbidden knowledge. But both stories serve a similar function. They explain the origin of evil. They assert that evil is not eternal or original. They promise that evil will ultimately be defeated. A medieval peasant living in a small village in France or England or Germany would have heard these stories from the priest in church. The peasant cannot read, has never seen a book, knows nothing of the Book of Enoch or the complexities of ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature. But he knows that the devil is real, that there are demons who tempt people to sin, that there is a cosmic battle between good and evil. His life is hard. He works the land from dawn to dusk. He suffers from disease and hunger and the depredations of war. But the stories give him a framework for understanding his suffering. The world is fallen because of sin. The devil and his demons are active in the world, causing harm. But Christ has won the victory, and in the end, the faithful will be rewarded with eternal life in heaven. On feast days, the village gathers in the small stone church. Candles flicker. The priest chants in Latin words the peasant does not understand. But the peasant knows he is participating in something holy, something that connects him to the great cosmic drama of salvation. The stories of fallen angels and divine judgment are part of the backdrop of his faith, part of how he makes sense of the world. In the Islamic world, as mentioned, there are related traditions about fallen angels and jinn. The jinn are beings created from smokeless fire, capable of good and evil, who exist alongside humans, but in a realm usually invisible to us. Iblis, the devil in Islamic tradition, was a jinn who refused to bow before Adam when God commanded it, and was cast out of paradise for his disobedience. There are also Islamic stories of angels Harut and Marut, who were sent to earth and taught humans magic. These stories show some influence from earlier Jewish traditions, though they are developed in distinctly Islamic ways. A Muslim scholar in medieval Cairo or Damascus, studying the Quran and Hadith and the commentaries of earlier scholars, would have been aware of these traditions. He would have thought about the nature of angels and jinn, about the sources of knowledge, about the dangers of magic and sorcery. Imagine him in his study, late at night. A lamp burns, casting shadows on the walls lined with manuscripts. He is writing a commentary on a passage from the Quran about the jinn. He draws on various sources, earlier commentaries, oral traditions, his own reasoning and insight. He is trying to explain how the jinn fit into the cosmic order, how they relate to humans, what their role is in the divine plan. For him, as for the Christian peasant and the Jewish scribe and all the others across time and culture, these are not merely academic questions. They are about understanding the world, about navigating the dangers of life, about seeking truth and righteousness in a world that often seems chaotic and unjust. The enduring power of the Watcher tradition, in all its variations across cultures, lies in its ability to address fundamental human concerns. We want to know where evil comes from. We want to believe that it is not eternal, that it can be defeated. We want to understand why knowledge can be dangerous, why boundaries exist, what happens when they are transgressed. These are questions that every generation asks in its own way. In the modern period, the rediscovery of the Book of Enoch and the scholarly study of ancient Jewish and Christian literature has given us Picashian access to the Watcher tradition in its original complexity. We can read the ancient texts, trace their influences, understand how they functioned in their original contexts. This is valuable historical knowledge, helping us understand the development of religious ideas and the worldview of ancient communities. But the stories also continue to resonate beyond the academy. Writers and artists and filmmakers continue to be fascinated by the Watchers, by the idea of angels who fell, by the ambiguity of forbidden knowledge. The themes touch something deep in the human imagination. Think about how these themes appear in modern fiction, stories about Faustian bargains, about knowledge that corrupts, about beings from beyond who enter our world and change it irrevocably. The specific framework of the Watcher tradition may not be present, but the underlying concerns are the same. Or think about modern anxieties about technology. We create tools of immense power, nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and we worry about whether we have the wisdom to use them responsibly. We worry about Prometheus unbound, about knowledge and power that exceed our ability to control them. These are the same anxieties that produced the Watcher tradition thousands of years ago. The story of the Watchers reminds us that these concerns are not new, that humans have always grappled with questions about knowledge and power, boundaries and transgression, and it offers, in its own mythological way, a response, the assertion that there is a moral order to the universe, that transgressions will be judged, that ultimately justice will prevail. Whether one believes the story literally or reads it as metaphor or mythology, it carries this deeper message. And that message can be comforting, can help us make sense of a world that often seems senseless. As we move toward the close of this long journey through the Watcher tradition, let yourself rest more fully. Your body is heavy and relaxed. Your breathing is slow and deep. The stories we've traveled through tonight are old, so old, and yet they still speak to us. They connect us to the ancients who first told them, to everyone who has pondered them across the centuries. In Ethiopia, where the Book of Enoch was preserved, the tradition remained, living in a way that it did not elsewhere. The text was not a historical curiosity, but part of the scriptural canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Priests and monks copied it, studied it, incorporated its teachings into their theology and liturgy. Imagine a monastery in the Ethiopian highlands centuries ago. Stone buildings cluster on a mountainside. Monks live simply, devoting themselves to prayer and study. In the monastery's library, there are manuscripts in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language. Among these manuscripts are copies of the Book of Enoch, lovingly copied by generations of scribes. A young monk, newly arrived at the monastery, is learning to read Ge'ez. His teacher gives him the Book of Enoch to study. The young monk reads the ancient words, picturing Enoch's journey through the heavens, the punishment of the Watchers, the promise of final judgment. For him, this is not ancient history, but living truth, part of his faith, part of how he understands the world. He lives in a place of great beauty, green mountains, deep valleys, ancient churches carved from solid rock. The landscape seems to connect heaven and earth, and the stories of beings that crossed between the two realms seem fitting in such a place. When European explorers finally reached Ethiopia and discovered the Book of Enoch preserved there, it was a meeting of two streams of tradition that had been separated for over 1,000 years. The West had developed without the Book of Enoch, had created its own theological traditions about fallen angels and demons. Ethiopia had preserved the ancient text, had kept alive traditions that elsewhere had been forgotten. The rediscovery and translation of the Book of Enoch in the modern period has allowed scholars to study the development of Jewish and Christian thought with much greater nuance. We can see how ideas evolved, how different communities had different traditions, how texts influenced each other. The neat, linear narratives of religious development that were once taught have given way to a more complex picture, one that recognizes diversity and debate and multiple trajectories. This is good for historical understanding. It makes the past richer, more interesting, more human. The people of the past were not all following a single script. They were arguing, debating, creating new texts, reinterpreting old ones, trying to make sense of their experiences and their traditions. The Watcher tradition is one thread in this complex tapestry. It represents one way that ancient Jews thought about the origin of evil, one way they interpreted cryptic passages in their scriptures, one way they understood the relationship between heaven and earth. It was not the only way. Rabbinic Judaism developed quite different approaches, but it was an important way, one that influenced early Christianity and has continued to fascinate people ever since. As you lie in bed in the darkness, let these thoughts drift through your mind like clouds across the night sky. The Watchers, those ancient beings of myth and legend, they have watched over our imaginations for thousands of years. They have taken different forms in different cultures, but the core idea remains beings that crossed boundaries, that brought knowledge and chaos, that were punished and bound. The story ends, as it began, with a sense of boundaries restored, order re-established. The Watchers are bound in darkness, awaiting judgment. The flood has cleansed the earth. Humanity can begin again, though the memory of what happened lingers, transmitted through stories told by firelight. Stories written on clay and papyrus and parchment and paper. Stories that have traveled across continents and centuries to reach us here tonight. There is something deeply satisfying about the structure of the story: transgression, chaos, judgment, restoration. It maps onto a moral universe that makes sense, that asserts meaning and purpose even in the face of suffering. Whether we believe the story literally or read it symbolically, it offers this framework for understanding. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps what we need from our old stories is not literal truth, but meaningful truth. Narratives that help us make sense of our experience, that connect us to something larger than ourselves, that remind us that we are part of an ongoing human conversation about what matters and why. The Watchers have been bound for ages upon ages, according to the tradition. They await the final judgment, the end of days, when all accounts will be settled and a new creation will emerge. But their story continues to be told, continues to be pondered, continues to work in the human imagination. And so we come to the end of our journey through this ancient tradition. We have traveled from the rivers of Mesopotamia to the hills of Judea, from Ethiopian monasteries to modern scholarly debates. We have seen how a story can travel and transform, how it can be lost and found, how it can speak to generation after generation with different voices but similar concerns. As you drift toward sleep, let yourself feel connected to this long chain of storytellers and listeners, of scribes and scholars, of believers and skeptics, all pondering the same deep questions about knowledge and power, about good and evil, about the structure of reality and our place within it. The night is quiet. The stars shine overhead, the same stars that the ancient Mesopotamians watched, that the Jewish communities of the Second Temple period observed, that have looked down on countless generations, wondering about what lies beyond. Those stars, in the ancient imagination, were associated with angels, with the heavenly host, with the watchers who observed humanity from their celestial stations. Tonight, those stars shine on you as you lie in your bed, preparing for sleep. The ancient stories have been told. The watchers remain bound in their darkness, mythological prisoners in a mythological prison, but real in the sense that all powerful stories are real, real in their effects, real in how they shape thought and feeling and understanding. Rest now. Let the weight of these ancient words settle over you like a blanket. Let the rhythm of the story carry you gently toward sleep. There is something soothing about knowing that humans have always told stories, have always tried to understand, have always looked for patterns and meaning in the chaos of existence. The watchers, in their transgression and punishment, remind us that boundaries matter, that some knowledge might come at too high a cost, that order and chaos are in constant tension. But they also remind us, perhaps, of the deep human desire to cross boundaries, to reach beyond ourselves, to know what is forbidden. This tension is part of what makes us human, the pull between safety and exploration, between accepting limits and transgressing them. In the end, the Watcher tradition offers no easy answers. It is a myth, a story, a way of thinking about difficult questions. Different people will draw different conclusions from it. Some will see a warning about the dangers of pride and disobedience. Others will see a tragedy of beings punished for love or curiosity. Still others will read it as a metaphor for historical or psychological realities. All of these readings are valid. The story is rich enough to support multiple interpretations, as all enduring myths are. What matters is that the story continues to be told, continues to provoke thought and feeling, continues to connect us to our ancestors who first shaped these narratives out of their own experiences and wonderings. Sleep now. Let the watchers keep their vigil from their prison in the darkness. Let the ancient words fade into the background of your consciousness. Let the rhythms of breath and heartbeat take over, the deep bodily rhythms that connect you to all living things, that have pulsed through billions of bodies across billions of years. The story has been told. The ancient world has shared its secrets with you. Now is the time for rest, for dreams, for the quiet darkness of sleep, where the conscious mind releases its grip and deeper patterns emerge. Good night.